Welcome to Delphos Insights. This is episode 30, where we examine renewable energy opportunities in emerging markets 2026, where institutional capital should deploy. In today's capital environment, navigating the global energy transition requires more than just identifying abundant natural resources. It demands disciplined capital stack structuring and robust grid integration. As renewable capacity accelerates across emerging markets, institutional capital will only flow to projects that successfully align clear risk allocation with resilient, long-duration financial structures. So, to translate that into plain English for those of you joining this deep dive, if you're listening and wondering why the massive global push for green energy sometimes feels like it is, moving at a snail's pace in the regions that need it most, you are in the right place.
Exactly, because, the official macroeconomic view is that the world is completely ready to deploy just massive amounts of capital right now.
Right.
Like the International Energy Agency is projecting global energy investment to reach $3.3 trillion in 2025.
3.3 trillion.
Wow. Yeah. Which is a 2% real-term growth compared to 2024. It's just a staggering amount of money. We're sitting at this pivotal moment where cross-sector capital flows are finally being coordinated at a global scale.
And the trajectory of where all that capital is supposed to go is really fascinating, right? Because renewables are projected to meet over 90% of electricity demand growth.
Right, over 90%.
And by 2025 or 2026, they are fully expected to surpass coal as the world's largest electricity source. So the money is theoretically there, the technology is undeniably taking over, but here's the central mystery we really need to unpack today. With $3.3 trillion floating around, why does the actual deployment of that capital so often stall out?
Well, it stalls because there's this massive disconnect between having the capital and having a safe place where that capital can actually land. The renewable energy industry fundamentally requires patient capital. It takes years to build these projects and, decades to see the full return. And patient capital requires a structurally sound environment. Institutional investors are no longer just looking at a map, finding a great solar resource, and blindly throwing money at it.
So they aren't just funding sunlight anymore.
No, not at all. They are hyper-focused on outcomes that align with local energy security, comprehensive grid upgrades, and just broader economic growth. Capital doesn't flow into a vacuum. It only flows into a resilient, highly structured financial ecosystem.
Let's ground that theory in a specific geography. Because if you want to see the starkest possible contrast between natural resource abundance and capital deployment, you have to look at Africa.
Oh, absolutely. The access gap there is just staggering.
Right. Across Sub-Saharan Africa, you have approximately 600 million people without electricity. That is 47% of the population.
Yeah.
Which represents a massive 83% of the entire global unelectrified population.
Yeah.
So the need is undeniable.
The need is totally undeniable, but the capital allocation tells a very different, highly concentrated story. Just look at where the investment actually lands on the continent. South Africa and North Africa contain less than 20% of the population.
Okay.
But they capture over 45% of the total energy investment, and they hold more than 65% of the installed capacity.
Wait, I need to push back on that for a second. Less than 20% of the population is pulling in almost half the money.
Yeah.
Because if I am looking at a map of solar potential, the equator is just flooded with sunlight. And the hardware adoption is booming, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you look at the 12 months leading up to June 2025, solar panel imports hit a record 15,032 megawatts.
Right, the imports are surging.
Yeah, that is a 60% increase year over year. The hardware is arriving. So why is the capital so heavily biased toward just the northern and southern tips of the continent?
It all comes down to the infrastructure that surrounds those panels. To use an analogy, importing 15,032 megawatts of solar panels into regions without parallel grid upgrades, it's exactly like manufacturing thousands of incredibly high-speed, state-of-the-art vehicles, but completely refusing to build any highways for them to drive on.
Oh, I see. So you have all these Ferraris, but no paved to drive them.
Exactly. The sunlight is abundant, the panels are literally sitting in the ports, but without the transmission highways to move that power from the field to a city, the energy essentially becomes stranded. It has nowhere to go.
Right.
So grid infrastructure remains the absolute primary constraint. Building a solar farm is relatively straightforward, but building a high-voltage transmission network across multiple jurisdictions is incredibly complex and expensive.
I can imagine. So what kind of investment are we talking about for the grid?
Well, grid investment in these regions must increase by 50% by 2030 just to keep pace with the energy transition. The target right now is 300 million new grid connections by 2030.
300 million. That is a monumental undertaking.
It is, and achieving that, or utilizing off-grid and distributed solar models to bridge the gap, well, it comes down to one critical phrase: structural bankability. Bankability, not sunlight, dictates where the capital flows.
Okay, so let's unpack structural bankability, because that sounds like investment banking jargon.
Yeah.
And we need to understand how it actually works on the ground. If I am an institutional investor sitting in London or New York, what does structural bankability actually look like in practice?
It means the financial architecture of the project has to completely insulate you, the investor, from unacceptable localized risks. It's about building financial shock absorbers. For example, it often requires what we call blended finance.
Right, which basically means mixing different types of money.
Correct. So in a blended finance structure, development capital-like money from international aid organizations or development banks, they take on the earlier, higher risk stages of a project.
So they take the first hit if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And because that safety net exists, commercial investors feel secure enough to step in and provide the massive scale of capital needed. But beyond that, structural bankability requires absolute clarity in power purchase agreements. An investor needs a highly credible off-taker.
Meaning the entity that is actually buying the electricity.
Precisely. If you build a massive solar farm, you need to know with absolute certainty that the local utility, the off-taker, is actually capable of purchasing it, transmitting it, and paying for it reliably every single month for the next 20 years. If that utility is financially insolvent, your incredible solar farm is suddenly worthless.
Which perfectly explains the concentration in South and North Africa. They have the established utilities and the regulatory frameworks that make investors feel safe.
Exactly.
So if Africa represents the immense struggle of building those initial generation and transmission highways, Latin America shows us a totally different problem. Latin America shows us what happens when clean energy actually scales successfully and grid integration becomes the main hurdle.
Yeah, that's a great transition because Latin America is operating with a 65% share of clean electricity as of 2024.
Wow. And wind and solar alone make up 17% of that total generation.
Which is a phenomenal achievement. It demonstrates a highly resilient energy mix. And within that region, Brazil is really the dominant force. They recently added 36 terawatt hours of new generation.
36 terawatt hours.
Yeah, which accounted for an astounding 78% of the regional growth.
Let's put that number into perspective, because 36 terawatt hours is not just a spreadsheet statistic. That is enough new, clean energy to power several entire metropolitan areas completely from scratch.
It really is.
But this brings up a terrifying underwriting challenge. If I'm an investor looking at Latin America and I see this massive wave of intermittent generation coming online, because the wind stops blowing or a storm blocks the sun, how on earth do you underwrite that volatility? How do you confidently deploy capital into a regional grid that could face severe sudden drops in power? To me, a grid heavily reliant on weather patterns sounds like a massive liability.
Well, it would be a liability if not for the stabilization mechanisms that have to be funded right alongside the generation. You underwrite that volatility by heavily investing in battery storage.
Oh, okay.
Globally, battery storage capacity is forecasted to reach 123 gigawatts by 2026. In Latin America, as wind and solar rapidly expand, grid-scale storage becomes the critical linchpin.
Because it fundamentally changes the nature of the power source.
Exactly. Think about the physics of a grid. Supply and demand must always perfectly match in real time, every single second. So if a cloud covers your largest solar farm at noon, the voltage across the grid instantly drops. But a battery system detects that drop and injects stored power in a matter of milliseconds.
Keeping the grid from blacking out.
Right. It essentially transforms a totally unpredictable, intermittent resource into a reliable, dispatchable asset. You store the noon sunlight and release it at 8 in the evening when everyone turns on their appliances.
Which completely alters the risk pricing for the investor. You are no longer just betting on the weather. You are underwriting a controlled, predictable system.
Precisely. Storage provides the grid flexibility required for complex peak load management. And, it is not just batteries. The introduction of energy efficiency technologies like smart heat pumps also helps stabilize the system by smoothing out sudden spikes in demand.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, this combination allows the region to manage a much larger share of its consumption directly from renewables, which directly displaces legacy thermal generation like old coal or oil plants during periods of high volatility. It drives down overall system costs.
And you can actually see institutional capital waking up to this reality. Just recently, there was a $67 million grid integration financing package in Brazil.
Yes.
That is a massive, clear market signal. The smart capital is no longer just chasing new, flashy solar farms. It is aggressively targeting the supply chain innovation and grid upgrades required to actually handle all that power.
Because without that integration financing, the physical system literally breaks down. Grid integration is no longer an afterthought. It is now the core institutional investment theme.
That dynamic leads us perfectly into South Asia. If Latin America is using massive battery storage to smooth out the weather volatility, South Asia offers a masterclass in utilizing hybrid systems to manage the reality of a rapidly expanding economy.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers there are just incredible.
Right. India alone captured an 83% share of all power sector investment in clean energy in 2024. They are currently sitting at 44% non-fossil capacity, and they have a hard target of hitting 50% by 2030.
Those numbers indicate a rapid, unprecedented transformation. But it is the specific methodology of that transformation that institutional investors really need to study.
Right, because advanced, wealthy economies often push this narrative that everyone should aim for a pure 100% renewable grid right out of the gate. But when you are looking at emerging markets in South Asia, where electricity demand growth is just skyrocketing year over year as millions enter the middle class, you are forced into a completely different calculus.
You are. A purely renewable grid operating in an environment with skyrocketing demand is often neither technologically nor financially viable in the near term. The batteries alone would be astronomically expensive. This is exactly why South Asia is deploying hybrid models.
Meaning they combine different sources.
Exactly. They are intelligently combining solar, wind, and natural gas infrastructure into a single, cohesive strategy.
I love this concept. Think of the hybrid grid like a hybrid car. The solar panels and the wind turbines are your electric battery. They are cheap, clean, and incredibly efficient for the daily cruise. But natural gas is the combustion engine that kicks in instantly, the second you need to drive up a steep hill of sudden energy demand.
That is a perfect analogy. Natural gas provides the crucial fast-ramping capability that a grid operator desperately needs when solar generation drops off at sunset, just as evening demand spikes.
Right.
These hybrid systems stabilize the electricity demand, and they dramatically strengthen overall grid reliability. They represent a pragmatic, highly bankable transition strategy. Furthermore, South Asia is actively implementing crucial grid code reforms and rapidly expanding distributed solar networks.
Let's talk about those grid code reforms, because they are honestly the unsung heroes of bankability. We talk about money and panels, but the grid codes are the actual traffic laws for electrons.
They really are.
They set the new benchmarks for how power flows across the wires, how priority is given to a solar farm over a coal plant, and how the overall supply chain is managed. By clarifying the rules of the road, it paves the way for future electric vehicle deployment and broader battery technologies. It makes everything predictable.
And predictability is exactly what institutional capital demands before it moves. When an institutional investment committee looks at South Asia right now, they do not just see growing demand. They see a region that is actively and transparently rewriting its entire regulatory framework to successfully accommodate these complex hybrid systems.
So let's step back and synthesize these regional dynamics. Whether we are looking at the desperate need for de-risked, credible power purchase agreements in Sub-Saharan Africa, or the massive storage and integration financing required in Latin America, or the pragmatic hybrid grid codes in South Asia, there is a unified filter through which all this global capital must pass.
Yes, the institutional filter. It is ruthless, but it is highly rational.
Right.
As the overall availability of capital continues to grow globally, that capital is simultaneously becoming highly selective. Investors are simply no longer willing to take equity risks on projects that have shaky regulatory foundations or poor infrastructure planning.
They need guarantees.
Exactly. Capital only deploys when there is incredibly disciplined capital stack structuring and clear, legally binding risk allocation.
Let's demystify capital stack structuring for a second. That is essentially just the financial layer cake of a project, right? It dictates exactly who gets paid first when things go well, and more importantly, who takes the financial hit when things go wrong.
That's a great way to put it.
It is the difference between having a really noble idea for a wind farm and having a credible, ironclad revenue model.
Exactly. To survive the extreme scrutiny of an institutional investment committee, your project must reach financial close by explicitly proving that every single potential point of failure has been anticipated. From grid curtailment, which is when the grid operator forces you to stop producing power because the lines are full, to off-taker default.
Where the buyer just goes bankrupt.
Yes. Every risk must be mitigated and legally allocated to the party that is best equipped to handle it. And we can actually see this extreme discipline in action across very specific markers today. Look at the MTC Energy Solutions transaction.
Or the massive global power platform financing.
Exactly. Or even the Ethiopia geothermal feasibility study.
Those transactions are essentially proof points for the entire industry. They are real-world, tangible examples of projects that successfully survived institutional-grade structuring. They navigated the incredibly rigorous requirements of DFI's development finance institutions and demanding commercial investors to actually reach the finish line.
They did. They deeply understood the core reality of our era. While the macroeconomic forces are pushing an incredible $3.3 trillion into the global energy transition, not a single dollar of that money actually moves without institutional-grade governance, strict risk pricing, and a clear path to grid integration.
Before we conclude, ask yourself, as emerging markets increasingly rely on hybrid systems and complex grid integrations, does your project's risk allocation truly reflect the nuances of the local regulatory environment? And is your financial structuring resilient enough to survive the scrutiny of an institutional investment committee?
That is the crucial question for anyone deploying capital today.
This has been Delphos Insights. Learn more at delphos.co.